Follow our rules today, or you can pay for this wedding yourself, Richard Carter said quietly to his daughter only 3 hours before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. The words hung in the air of the bridal suite like a sudden drop in temperature, sharp and unmistakable. Emily Carter stood in front of the tall mirror at the Grand Willows Hotel, her ivory dress half-zipped, her hair pinned carefully into soft curls by a stylist who had just stepped out to grab more hairspray. The room still smelled faintly of roses and powder, the same flowers that filled the ballroom downstairs where 200 guests would soon gather. Margaret Carter folded her arms beside the window, watching Emily with the calm, composed expression she used whenever she believed she was being perfectly reasonable. Richard remained near the door, his suit already pressed and immaculate, his tone controlled as if he were discussing a business contract instead of his daughter's wedding day. Emily slowly turned away from the mirror, confusion crossing her face. For a moment she thought she had misheard him. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. Richard sighed the way he often did when he believed someone was being unnecessarily difficult. "It's simple," he replied. "There are certain people who should not be here today. If you insist on ignoring our request, then Daniel and you can cover the bill yourselves." Emily felt the weight of the words settle heavily in the quiet room. 6 months of planning. Endless meetings with the florist, the caterer, the planner, the band. The carefully arranged seating chart. The elegant reception hall waiting downstairs with its white linen tables and polished glass centerpieces. She knew exactly how much the wedding cost because her father had mentioned the number more than once. $85,000. Margaret stepped forward, smoothing the front of Emily's dress with gentle but firm hands, her voice soft yet deliberate. "We're only asking you to be sensible, sweetheart. This day reflects our family too." Emily's heart beat a little faster as she realized exactly what they were referring to. The guest list. One name in particular had been the subject of quiet arguments for weeks. Daniel's uncle, Michael Brooks. To Daniel, he was family, the man who helped raise him after his father died. To Richard Carter, he was something else entirely. A rival, a reminder of a business conflict that had lasted for years. Emily had refused to remove him from the list. At the time, she believed the disagreement would fade the way most family disagreements eventually did. But now, standing in a room filled with wedding flowers and morning sunlight, she understood that her parents had not forgotten at all. Richard pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and placed it on the vanity table beside the mirror. It was the latest seating chart. A small red circle had been drawn around one name near the front row. "Michael Brooks. All you have to do is remove him," Richard said calmly. "Tell the planner he's not attending. Everything else continues exactly as planned." Emily stared at the paper without touching it. Downstairs, faint music from the string quartet drifted through the hallway as early guests began arriving. Somewhere a door closed softly and distant laughter echoed. The wedding day she had imagined for so long suddenly felt fragile, balanced on a single decision. Margaret gave her a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just think about it for a moment," she said gently. Richard glanced at his watch. "You have 20 minutes, he added. "After that, the decision will be yours." Emily remained standing in front of the mirror, the red circle on the paper reflecting faintly in the glass, realizing that the happiest day of her life had just turned into something very different. Emily Carter did not touch the paper on the vanity table. The red circle around Michael Brooks's name seemed almost brighter now, as if someone had drawn it with fresh ink moments ago. For several seconds, she simply stared at it, listening to the faint sounds drifting through the hallway outside the bridal suite. The low hum of conversation, the quiet roll of a luggage cart. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed softly. The hotel had been slowly filling with guests since early morning. Friends who had traveled hundreds of miles. Family members who had flown in from 3 different states. People who believed they were arriving to celebrate a joyful day. Emily inhaled slowly and looked up at her reflection again. Her dress was still only half-zipped. A small row of pearl buttons waited along the back, unfinished because the stylist had stepped out when her parents arrived. The room felt smaller now, heavier. Margaret Carter moved to the window and gently pulled the curtain aside, looking down toward the driveway where black sedans and rideshare cars were arriving every few minutes. "Your guests are starting to check in," she said quietly. Her voice carried the same calm tone she used whenever she believed the situation was under control. Richard Carter remained near the door, one hand resting lightly on the polished brass handle as if he had already decided the conversation was finished. Emily folded her arms slowly, more out of instinct than anger. Daniel invited him, she said carefully. He is family. Richard did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Family is a complicated word, he replied. There are people who support your life, and there are people who create unnecessary problems. Today is not the day for problems. Emily felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced many times during the past 6 months of wedding planning. At first everything had seemed simple. Daniel Brooks had proposed during a quiet weekend trip to Lake Geneva the previous autumn. Emily still remembered the cold breeze off the water and the way Daniel's hands had trembled slightly when he opened the small velvet box. They had spent the entire drive home talking excitedly about what their wedding might look like. A small ceremony, maybe 100 guests, something warm and relaxed. But when Emily told her parents about the engagement, the conversation had changed direction almost immediately. Richard Carter had congratulated them with a firm handshake and then asked a question that seemed harmless at the time. Have you considered where the reception will be held? Within 2 weeks, Margaret had scheduled a meeting with a luxury wedding planner. Within 3 weeks, the guest list had doubled. Within 2 months, the ceremony had moved from a quiet garden venue to the Grand Willows Hotel ballroom. Each decision had been presented as generous help. Richard insisted he wanted his daughter to have the best possible celebration. Margaret assured Emily that everything was meant to reduce stress. But the planning meetings gradually began to feel less like conversations and more like instructions. Certain relatives had to be invited. Certain business partners had to be seated near the front. The floral arrangements had to match the Carter family colors. Emily had tried to push back a few times, gently at first. Daniel had noticed the tension during one dinner 3 months earlier when Margaret calmly crossed 2 of Emily's college friends off the list because she believed the reception was becoming too casual. Daniel had squeezed Emily's hand under the table, silently asking if she was all right. Emily had smiled and told him it was only temporary stress. Now, standing in the bridal suite on the morning of her wedding, she understood that the tension had never been temporary at all. Emily Carter slowly lifted the seating chart from the vanity table, holding the paper carefully between her fingers as if it might tear under the weight of the moment. The red circle around Michael Brooks's name looked even more deliberate up close, a small mark that had suddenly turned into the center of a much larger conflict. For several seconds, she said nothing. She simply studied the list of names, row after row of guests who had traveled from different cities to be here today. Friends from college in Chicago, Daniel's cousins from Ohio, her aunt and uncle from Colorado who had driven nearly 900 miles to attend. Each name represented someone who believed they were part of a celebration. Emily finally placed the paper back on the table. He stays, she said quietly. Margaret Carter turned away from the window with a patient expression that suggested she had expected resistance. Emily, she began gently, you are not thinking about the larger picture. Richard Carter remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Your mother and I have been very clear about this, he said. There are certain boundaries that protect this family's reputation. Emily felt a slow wave of frustration rise in her chest. This is not a business event, she replied. It is my wedding. Richard shook his head once, almost disappointed. You say that as if those two things are separate. The quiet confidence in his voice reminded Emily of the countless times she had watched him run meetings in his downtown office tower. For decades, Richard Carter had built his career negotiating contracts and managing people who disagreed with him. His tone never rose, but his decisions rarely changed. Emily remembered one particular dinner 6 weeks earlier when the tension around Michael Brooks had first surfaced openly. Daniel had invited his uncle to join them at a small Italian restaurant downtown. The evening had begun pleasantly enough. Margaret had complimented the restaurant. Richard had asked Daniel questions about his architecture firm. But halfway through the meal, Michael Brooks had arrived, smiling warmly as he greeted Emily with a hug and shook Daniel's hand with obvious pride. Emily had noticed the subtle shift in Richard's posture almost immediately. The conversation grew polite but distant. Michael spoke openly about helping Daniel through college after Daniel's father passed away. Daniel listened with the quiet respect he always showed the man who had supported him for so many years. Richard Carter, however, barely touched his food. When Michael finally excused himself after dessert, Richard waited until the restaurant door closed behind him before setting down his fork. "That man will not be attending this wedding," he said calmly. Emily had stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. Daniel had spoken first, trying to keep the moment light. "He is the closest thing I have to a father," Daniel explained gently. Richard's response had been immediate. "Then perhaps you should consider a smaller ceremony." The conversation that followed had stretched late into the night, polite words hiding a deeper conflict neither side wanted to fully confront. Emily had believed time would soften the disagreement. Now she realized her father had never intended to compromise. Back in the bridal suite, the quiet ticking of the wall clock filled the room as Richard glanced at it again. 15 minutes, he said evenly. Downstairs the string quartet had begun playing the opening notes of a familiar classical piece as more guests arrived in the lobby. Emily imagined Daniel standing somewhere in the hotel, greeting relatives and adjusting his tie, completely unaware of the ultimatum unfolding upstairs. She looked again at the seating chart, then at her parents, understanding that the decision they were demanding from her was about much more than one name on a guest list. Emily Carter placed the seating chart back on the vanity table and pressed both palms lightly against the smooth surface as if steadying herself. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder now, each second marking the shrinking space between choice and consequence. Richard Carter remained near the door, calm and unmoving, the same composed posture he had used in countless boardrooms throughout his career. Margaret Carter stood quietly beside the window, watching her daughter with a mixture of concern and expectation that felt strangely rehearsed. Emily took a slow breath and looked once more at her reflection in the tall mirror. For a moment, she did not see a bride. She saw the last 6 months unfolding in small memories that suddenly made far more sense than they had at the time. It had started with the venue. Emily and Daniel originally planned to hold the ceremony in a botanical garden just outside the city, a place filled with tall oak trees and quiet walking paths. The venue held only 100 guests and offered simple wooden chairs and natural floral arrangements. Daniel loved it immediately. Emily loved it even more. But during the first planning meeting, Margaret Carter had studied the photographs carefully before offering a gentle smile that Emily now recognized as the beginning of a negotiation. Margaret explained that the garden was lovely, but perhaps too informal for such an important family event. Richard had then suggested the Grand Willows Hotel ballroom, a space large enough for nearly 300 guests, with crystal chandeliers and a polished marble entrance that overlooked the city skyline. The decision had seemed generous at the time because Richard offered to cover the entire cost of the reservation without hesitation. From that moment forward, each planning step followed the same quiet pattern. The guest list expanded from 100 names to 180. Margaret recommended a specific florist who specialized in formal arrangements that matched the Carter family colors. Richard suggested inviting several longtime business partners who had known Emily since childhood. Emily had told herself that none of these decisions truly changed the meaning of the day. Daniel had supported her patience, reminding her that families sometimes expressed love through involvement, even when that involvement felt overwhelming. Yet there had been moments that Emily could not ignore. One afternoon 3 months earlier, Margaret had gently removed 4 of Emily's college friends from the guest list because she believed the reception seating should prioritize relatives and professional contacts. Emily had objected quietly, explaining that those friends had supported her through some of the most important years of her life. Margaret listened politely and then explained that weddings were not only personal celebrations, but also reflections of family legacy. Emily had eventually agreed to compromise because she believed maintaining peace would make the final day feel easier. Now, standing in the bridal suite with the morning sunlight stretching across the carpet, Emily realized that every small compromise had slowly built toward this exact moment. The red circle around Michael Brooks's name was simply the final piece of a pattern she had not wanted to recognize. Down in the lobby, another wave of guests arrived, their voices echoing faintly through the hallway as the string quartet continued playing. Somewhere in the hotel, Daniel Brooks was likely greeting relatives with the easy confidence that had always drawn people toward him. Emily closed her eyes briefly, picturing his quiet smile and the steady way he had stood beside her throughout the planning process. When she opened them again, the clock showed only 10 minutes remaining before her father expected an answer. Richard Carter followed her gaze and checked his watch once more. "Time moves quickly on important days," he said calmly. Emily looked from the clock to the seating chart and finally to her parents, understanding that what they were asking from her was not simply a change to a guest list, but a decision about who would truly control the beginning of her marriage. Emily Carter looked at the clock again and felt the quiet pressure of the passing minutes settle deeper into the room. 10 minutes had already become 8. The soft music from the string quartet downstairs drifted faintly through the hallway, calm and elegant, as if nothing unusual was happening anywhere in the building. Richard Carter stood exactly where he had been since the conversation began, calm and patient, the way a man waits for a decision he believes is inevitable. Margaret Carter walked slowly back toward the vanity table and rested her fingertips beside the seating chart. Her voice softened, almost gentle. "Emily, sweetheart, you are making this harder than it needs to be." Emily did not answer immediately. She studied the small red circle around Michael Brooks's name again and felt the weight of another memory surface unexpectedly. It was from 2 years earlier, long before wedding plans or guest lists or ultimatums. Daniel had taken her to a modest brick house in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of the city. The lawn had been slightly uneven and the front porch light flickered when the door opened, but the house had felt warm in a way Emily instantly recognized. Michael Brooks had welcomed them inside with an easy smile and a handshake that turned into a brief hug when he realized how nervous Daniel was about introducing them. That evening had been simple. A homemade dinner. Old photographs spread across a wooden dining table. Stories about Daniel's childhood that made him laugh and shake his head at the same time. Emily remembered watching the two men talk and realizing something important without anyone saying it out loud. Michael Brooks had not simply supported Daniel after his father died. He had quietly stepped into the empty space that loss created. The kind of presence that does not demand recognition, but becomes part of someone's life through years of steady kindness. Back in the bridal suite, Emily exhaled slowly and lifted her eyes toward her parents. "Daniel would never ask him to stay away," she said quietly. Richard Carter folded his arms. "Daniel is not the one paying $85,000 for this event." He replied with the same controlled tone he had used since the conversation began. Margaret nodded slightly, as if reinforcing a reasonable point. "Your father only wants this day to reflect the dignity of our family," she added. Emily looked around the room again. The carefully arranged bouquets, the elegant mirror framed in gold, the open garment bag hanging beside the closet door. Everything in the room had been selected to represent perfection. Yet the moment felt strangely hollow, as if the meaning of the day had quietly shifted while no one was looking. From the hallway came the sound of quick footsteps, and then a light knock on the door. A voice followed, warm but slightly breathless. "Emily, it is Laura Bennett from the planning team. I just wanted to let you know the next round of guests is arriving and the ceremony schedule is still right on time." Emily turned her head toward the door, but did not move. "Thank you, Laura," she called gently. The footsteps moved away again. Richard Carter glanced at his watch once more. 5 minutes, he said. Emily returned her gaze to the seating chart. She traced the edge of the paper slowly with her fingertip, then looked toward the mirror where her unfinished dress reflected softly in the morning light. In that reflection, she saw the quiet crossroads forming in front of her life, a moment that would shape not only the next hour but the kind of future she and Daniel were about to begin together. Emily Carter remained still for several seconds after the footsteps faded down the hallway. The quiet of the bridal suite returned again, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt measured, as if every second carried weight. Richard Carter lowered his wrist slowly after checking his watch, his expression unchanged, the calm patience of a man who believed time was working in his favor. Margaret Carter adjusted one of the bouquets near the vanity table, straightening a pale rose that had tilted slightly. The movement was small, almost delicate, yet it carried the same quiet certainty that had guided every decision throughout the planning process. Emily looked once more at the seating chart resting on the table. The red circle around Michael Brooks's name remained there like a small challenge. For the first time since the conversation began, Emily reached for the paper again. She lifted it slowly and held it at eye level. Her gaze moved down the rows of names carefully, one after another, until she reached the circled name again. Michael Brooks. Daniel Brooks's uncle. The man who had quietly helped raise him. The man who had once driven 300 miles overnight when Daniel's car broke down during his final year of college. Emily remembered Daniel telling that story one evening while they were cooking dinner together in their small apartment. Daniel had laughed softly as he described waking up at 2 in the morning to find Michael already knocking on his dorm door with a toolbox and a thermos of coffee. No lectures, no complaints, just quiet help when it was needed most. Emily lowered the paper again and placed it gently back on the vanity table. She finally turned to face her parents directly. "You both know what he means to Daniel," she said. Richard Carter responded immediately. "And you know what he represents to me." The tone remained calm but firm, as if the two meanings could never exist in the same room. Margaret Carter clasped her hands together and spoke softly. "Emily, your father is not trying to control your life. He is trying to protect it." Emily felt a small, tired smile appear before she even realized it. "Protect it from what?" she asked. Neither parent answered immediately. Outside in the hallway, another wave of voices passed by, excited and cheerful, the natural sounds of wedding guests greeting one another. The contrast between that laughter and the stillness inside the bridal suite felt almost surreal. Richard Carter stepped forward slightly and placed both hands on the back of a nearby chair. "There are relationships that bring stability," he said evenly, "and there are relationships that introduce complications. Michael Brooks has spent years challenging decisions that did not concern him." Emily understood now. The conflict between the two men had never been only about business. It had been about influence, respect, and control within the larger circle of family and reputation. The wedding simply placed that quiet rivalry under bright lights. Emily looked toward the mirror again, studying the reflection of her unfinished dress. The pearl buttons still waited along the back where the stylist had left them. She imagined Daniel standing downstairs somewhere, adjusting his tie nervously, probably wondering how much longer it would take before someone called him upstairs for photographs. Daniel had always believed the wedding would be the easiest part of their future together. Emily inhaled slowly and felt the weight of the moment settle into something clearer. Richard Carter checked his watch once more. 2 minutes, he said calmly. Emily turned back toward the vanity table, her eyes resting on the seating chart one final time, understanding that whatever she said next would define not only the next few hours, but the kind of boundaries her marriage would begin with. Emily Carter looked at the clock one last time as the minute hand moved forward with quiet certainty. The room felt suspended between two different futures. Richard Carter straightened his jacket slightly, already preparing for the answer he believed was coming. Margaret Carter watched her daughter carefully, her expression calm but alert, as though she were waiting for Emily to finally understand what she believed was the sensible choice. Emily did not look at either of them immediately. Instead, she reached for the seating chart once more and held it in both hands. The paper felt light, almost fragile, yet it carried the weight of the entire conversation. Her eyes moved slowly over the list of names again. Friends, relatives, colleagues, people who had shaped different chapters of her life. Then her gaze returned to the red circle. Michael Brooks. For a brief moment, Emily remembered the evening Daniel had first spoken about inviting him. They had been sitting on the small balcony outside their apartment watching the lights of the city after a long workday. Daniel had explained quietly that Michael had never expected recognition for the help he gave, but that Daniel could not imagine a wedding day without him present. Daniel had said something simple that night, something Emily had not fully understood until now. Some people earn their place in your life without asking for it. Emily placed the seating chart back onto the vanity table with steady hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Michael Brooks stays on the guest list. The room became very quiet. Richard Carter did not react immediately. He studied Emily with the careful expression of a man recalculating a negotiation. "Then you understand the consequences," he said evenly. Emily nodded once. "Yes." Margaret Carter stepped forward slightly, her voice softer but more urgent now. "Emily, please think carefully. Your father is offering you an opportunity to avoid unnecessary complications today." Emily turned toward her mother gently. "Mom, the complication already exists." Richard Carter slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. His movements remained controlled, but there was a new firmness in his posture. "Very well. he said. If that is your decision, then I will inform the planner that the financial responsibility for this event is no longer ours. Emily watched him calmly. The words sounded dramatic, yet something about the moment felt strangely quiet inside her mind. For months, the idea that her parents were paying for the wedding had shaped every conversation, every compromise, every uncomfortable meeting with vendors and planners. The number $85,000 had floated over every decision like a silent reminder of obligation. Now that number seemed to dissolve into the background. Emily glanced again at the mirror where her unfinished dress reflected softly in the morning light. She imagined Daniel waiting downstairs, unaware of the conversation unfolding above the ballroom. She imagined the ceremony beginning not with perfect approval from everyone in the room, but with honesty about the kind of life they wanted to build together. Richard Carter looked up from his phone. I assume you are prepared to explain this to Daniel, he said. Emily met his eyes steadily. Daniel will understand. The quiet confidence in her voice lingered in the room. For the first time since the conversation began, Richard Carter hesitated before responding. Outside in the hallway, a burst of cheerful laughter echoed as another group of guests arrived. Somewhere downstairs, the music shifted into a brighter melody, signaling that the ceremony would begin soon. Emily looked once more at the seating chart on the table and then back at her parents, realizing that the real decision had never been about a single guest. It had always been about whether her future would begin with obedience or with choice. Richard Carter looked down at the phone in his hand for a moment, as if considering whether to place the call immediately. The quiet confidence that had carried him through the entire conversation remained visible in the set of his shoulders. Margaret Carter watched him carefully, waiting for him to follow through on the warning he had just given. Emily Carter, however, no longer felt the same pressure that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Something inside her had shifted the moment she spoke her decision out loud. The silence stretched for several seconds until another soft knock sounded on the door of the bridal suite. Before anyone answered, the door opened slightly and Laura Bennett, the wedding planner, stepped inside with a professional but slightly hurried smile. Emily, I am sorry to interrupt again, she said gently. The ceremony team is preparing the final seating downstairs, and we just wanted to confirm that everything is still moving forward on schedule. Her eyes moved briefly between Emily and her parents, sensing the unusual tension in the room, but not commenting on it. Richard Carter straightened and spoke before Emily could respond. Actually, Ms. Bennett, there has been a change, he said calmly. You should be aware that I am withdrawing financial responsibility for this event. My daughter has chosen to proceed under her own arrangements. Laura Bennett blinked once, clearly surprised, but she did not appear alarmed. She looked toward Emily with quiet professionalism. Is that correct? She asked. Emily nodded slowly. Yes. The guest list will remain exactly as it is. Laura paused for a moment, as if reviewing information in her mind. Then she gave a small, reassuring smile that seemed almost unexpected. In that case, there is no problem at all, she said. Richard Carter frowned slightly. No problem, he repeated. Laura folded her hands politely in front of her. Mr. Carter, the payment for today's event was finalized 3 weeks ago through the Carter Family Trust account. The words seemed to settle into the room slowly. Margaret Carter looked confused. The trust account? She asked. Laura nodded gently. Yes. The account established by Mrs. Eleanor Carter several years ago. According to the documentation we received, the funds were specifically designated to cover Emily Carter's wedding expenses at her full discretion. Richard Carter's expression changed for the first time since the conversation began. That arrangement was meant to supplement our contribution, he said firmly. Laura shook her head slightly. Actually, sir, the trust agreement states that the bride is the sole decision-maker regarding how the funds are used. The payments for the venue, catering, music, and floral services were all processed directly through that account. Emily felt a quiet realization settle over her as she listened. Her grandmother Eleanor Carter had always been a thoughtful woman who rarely spoke loudly, but often planned carefully. Emily remembered visiting her small house every summer as a child, listening to Eleanor explain that true generosity meant giving someone freedom rather than control. Laura continued gently. From our perspective, the financial arrangements have already been completed. The ceremony and reception are fully secured. Richard Carter lowered the phone slowly, The certainty that had filled the room earlier now replaced with visible hesitation. Margaret looked between her husband and daughter in silence. Emily glanced toward the mirror once more, where the unfinished line of pearl buttons still waited along the back of her dress. Downstairs, the music from the string quartet rose into a bright melody as more guests took their seats. Emily understood now that the decision she had made minutes earlier had quietly removed the last piece of leverage from the conversation. For the first time that morning, the room no longer felt like a negotiation. Richard Carter lowered his phone completely and placed it slowly back into his jacket pocket. For the first time that morning, he did not seem certain what to say next. The quiet authority that had guided the conversation only minutes earlier had softened into something closer to reflection. Margaret Carter looked toward Laura Bennett, then back at Emily, clearly trying to understand how a detail so significant had never surfaced during the months of planning. Laura Bennett offered a small professional smile and spoke gently. The ceremony is scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. The guests are already being seated in the ballroom. Whenever you are ready, Emily, the bridal team, can help finish preparing your dress. Emily nodded quietly. Laura stepped out of the room again, closing the door behind her with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the planning process. The bridal suite returned to silence. Outside in the hallway, the music from the string quartet floated upward through the building, bright and hopeful. Emily walked slowly toward the mirror and looked at the reflection of her dress once more. The unfinished row of pearl buttons waited along the back exactly where the stylist had left them. For a moment, she simply studied the reflection, letting the calm settle over her thoughts. Behind her, Richard Carter cleared his throat softly. Your grandmother was always very deliberate with her decisions, he said after a long pause. The sentence carried no anger now, only quiet acknowledgement. Emily turned slightly. She believed people should be trusted to choose their own lives, Emily replied. Margaret Carter folded her hands together and looked down at the seating chart resting on the vanity table. The red circle around Michael Brooks's name was still visible. For a few seconds, Margaret studied it without speaking. Then she gently picked up the paper and placed it back onto the table exactly as it had been before. Guests should not feel unwelcome at a wedding, she said quietly. Richard did not immediately respond, but the tension that had filled the room earlier no longer returned. Emily stepped forward and lifted the necklace that had been laid carefully beside the mirror. It had belonged to her grandmother Eleanor Carter for many years. The small silver chain held a delicate pendant that caught the morning light as she fastened it around her neck. A soft knock sounded again, and this time the bridal stylist entered carrying a small tray of hairpins. Are we ready to finish? She asked warmly. Emily smiled. Yes. The stylist moved behind her and began fastening the row of pearl buttons one by one. Each small click felt like a quiet step forward. When the final button was secured, Emily took a steady breath and turned toward the door. Richard Carter stepped aside to allow her to pass first. As Emily reached the doorway, she paused briefly and looked back at both of her parents. The conversation that had begun as a negotiation had ended somewhere very different. The choice had already been made. Downstairs, the music swelled gently as the first guests settled into their seats. Emily walked into the hallway, the soft fabric of her dress brushing quietly against the carpet, ready to begin the ceremony not as a decision controlled by someone else, but as the first chapter of a life she had chosen for herself.